Yes, we can get started with the first session. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker, Slava Kornev.
Yes.
Slava Kornev. And the other authors are Sian Wang, Vaidyanathan Tyagarajan, and Sai Gopal Nelaturi. And it's about lots of droplets being properly arranged with one another.
Yes.
Slava, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you a lot for introduction. So let me start. Yeah, so today I will talk about how to estimate shape of a sprinted part considering manufacturing uncertainty. So, and EM process 3D printing is always uncertain. You have uncertainty in material properties, in the deposition location, in a process parameters, and this uncertainty propagates from a smallest scale, from a scale of a deposition event to the scale of a part. And as a result, the final part, as printed part shape, it has deviation. It has a shape deviation. So this image shows overlapping of 80 part, and you can see that it's a slice, and the black line it's a toolpath, and the gray color it's a probability of material accumulation. Basically, you take a pixel and you count how many times this pixel is filled versus total number of times. And you can see that around the boundary there is like a gray, like a blurred. The boundary is blurred. So this blurring because you have a deviation right at the boundary, and at the middle you have a pretty uniform. So it's filled with 100% probability. So if you want to estimate shape of from additive manufacturing, you have to consider this uncertainty. And we create a framework to quantify and predict uncertainty of a sprinted shape, and we do it across multiple scales. So for an example, we consider metal jetting as a EM process. So this essential part of the printer, it's a chamber filled with a liquid metal, and there is a nozzle at the bottom of the chamber with a meniscus, and there is a coil around the chamber. So the coil has a current. A current creates magnetic field. Magnetic field creates pressure inside chamber, and if this pressure overcome the surface tension, you get droplet ejected. So by controlling impulses of the current, the timing, the duration, you can control how frequent you eject a droplet, and controlling the bed speed, you can control the overlapping between droplets. So process parameters, the printing frequency, degree of a droplet overlapping. Let me to play video again. And source of uncertainty, it's a droplet velocity, mass, and droplet parameters. So you can see the video how droplet get deposited. So you print it line by line. So it looks like a continuous jet, but the frequency is a pretty high. That's why but there are like a discrete droplet there. So so we get this process, and to understand uncertainty at the part scale, you really have to have a model, certain model at the droplet scale. You have to, and using this model and introducing uncertainty in a droplet scale, you can understand how it goes to the translate to the uncertainty at the part scale. And this slide summarizes a physical model of the metal jetting at the droplet scale. So we model it a droplet dynamic as a droplet solidification using incompressible Navier-Stokes equation, using heat transfer and conservation of a mass fraction. So we have three type of species: gas, liquid, and solid. So I will not go into details about this equation, but just would like to know that we model solidification using a Darcy term. So it's basically a momentum sink. So the solid, it's a frozen liquid, because we are not concerned with stresses. We can get away with it. So it's a simplified model of the phase change. And most of parameters of this model can be measured from direct experiment, like densities, surface tension, etc. And these parameters are listed on this slide for alloy 4043. But there are two parameters which cannot be measured because model is simplified. We have two parameters which have to be tweaked compare it with experiment to calculate this value, to get this value. So these parameters are Darcy drag term, and basically it tells you how much drag you introduce to liquid to become solid, and the time scale of the solidification called Lee constant. So we compare, we find this parameter by comparing output of our model with the direct experiment, and we solve a model, the system of equation using finite volume scheme. We use open form and volume of fluid for interface treatment. So this slide summarizes comparing on a droplet scale, a solidification of a droplet experiment versus simulation. So I put side by side. Left figure shows the simulation, and the right figure, black and white, shows the droplet profile at different time scale. So the figure below, the information below the dashed line is not relevant because it's a mirroring, it's a reflection. Experiment was done on a mirror. So you can see first that before solidifying to a final shape, it's a bottom right figure. It shows final shape. Droplet dynamic is very complex. It bounces back and bounce again. And you also see that the simulation capture pretty well a shape of the solidification as well as a time scale. So this slide summarizes comparing of the solidification of two droplets. You can see that if you deposit a second droplet, it creates a bridge with the first droplet. And on the left-hand side, it's experimental measurements. You can see the same bridge. And the video show the process of droplet solidification. You can see how this dynamic is complex. So before solidifying, droplets interact with the first one. And this slide summarizes comparing simulation with experiment for a line of droplets. So the yellow color shows the experimental, it's the simulations, the left top figure, and the rest figures are actual experimental measurements. So you can see the first droplet and the second. So the first droplet looks like a pancake. It spreads out, and the second has a different shape, and our simulation, our model captures this. So okay, so now we have a physics model, which is pretty accurate for on a scale of a droplet. So let's simulate a part introducing uncertainty in a location of a droplet deposition. So this is an example of a simulated cubes. And you can see that the shapes of cubes are slightly different because there is uncertainty in a droplet location. And in a framed figure, you can see the overlapping all of the shape. It's like a probability field that voxel is filled with material. So you just overlap these cubes and see how many times voxel is filled with the material. So this is the same for the pyramids. So okay, so you have a model. You can introduce uncertainty in a droplet scale and see how it translates to a part scale. But this is very computationally heavy. It takes probably like 2-3 weeks to simulate these pyramids. So it's very expensive and it's very heavy. So that's why we did the model order reduction to speed up the process, the simulation time. And model order reduction is based on the search. Basically, so from multi-physics simulation, we have an output. So we have a training set. So it's a surface on the left-hand side of substrate, and on the right-hand side, it's a shape of solidified droplet. And our model reduced the model based on a search in this for given substrate, we can find a shape of solidified droplet. And to accelerate the search, we represent a substrate as a height field. Just search is better, and we use k nearest neighborhood for the search. So this reduced the model has three parameters. It's number of neighbors and one parameter, other parameter, and controlling how we deposit this the reduced order model droplet. And we identify these parameters by comparing surrogate model, reduced order model with the physics simulation. So the first line of first figure shows a comparison. Left, it's a physics, right, it's a surrogate. So we identify these two parameters. Now let's validate how they work on a different geometry. And the bottom series of bottom figures show validation for cone. So left figure, it's a physics, middle figure, it's a surrogate, and on the right figure, we overlap output from multi-physics and surrogate. You can see that they're pretty close. So now there is a question, how to quantify uncertainty, which translates from a droplet scale to a part scale. How to quantify part scale uncertainty, so geometry can be different. This is a video of a part scale from a multiphysics from a surrogate model. So you can see how well we resolve each droplet, how high is the resolution. And now we concern the question how to quantify the part scale uncertainty, and the answer comes from astronomical image processing, particularly concept of point spread function. So astronomers found that a point source actually doesn't look like a point source on a photon detector. It looks like it's a blurred, and the reason of blurring because of the atmosphere, the optical system introduce variations. And the figure at the middle shows the example how the point source translated to point spread function for Hubble Space Telescope. You see how much the blurring affected. And if you have not a point source, you have an extended source, and you have a blurring effect, and mathematically described by a convolution. So the series of bottom figures show how convolution works. If you have extended source of light or extended function, and you have a point spread function at the middle, and you perform the convolution, you can see the result at the right. You can see that the function is smoothed out. It's how convolution works, or blurred. And mathematically, convolution is described by integral equation. So bottom line shows the convolution with a point spread function. And if PSF doesn't depend on intensity, it's a shift invariant. So it's effectively depends only on a single parameter. So we take this idea of a point spread function of a convolution and applied it into quantifying uncertainty of a part scale of additive manufacturing. And we see additive manufacturing process as a translation of a toolpath, which is shown on the left as it's like a sharp image in an image processing notation, and it translates it to a blurred probability field shown at the right. And this reason of a blurring because of the uncertainty in the process. So if and point spread function, we call it kernel here. So if kernel is known and you have a toolpath, so you can always estimate the probability field, and you can threshold probability field and get the shape with a given probability. So, and toolpath is always known, but kernel is not known. But you can estimate the probability field from multiphysics model, for example, or from experiment. You just print or simulate many parts of the same with the same toolpath, introduce uncertainty, overlap them, you have a probability field. But to find a kernel, you have to solve the integral equation. You have to invert that equation. You have to invert the convolution. This problem is ill-posed. There's a whole mathematical theory of it. This problem can be formulated as an optimization problem. So the top formulas show the optimization for to find the kernel. So we find a kernel such that it optimizes input versus output. So we have a probability field, we have a toolpath convolved with the kernel, and we want to optimize the difference. We want to find kernel which optimizes difference, the norm. So we simulate many parts with a reduced order model. We have many geometries, and each geometry have many realization. We solve this optimization problem using convolutional neural network because this very convenient way of solving this optimization. It's using CNN with a single layer and zero bias. And bottom figures show the plot of the volumetric plot of the kernel found by the deconvolution. So now you have a kernel. Now you can do estimation of a part shape comparing with a surrogate model. And this slide summarizes the comparison of output of a surrogate model of multiphysics simulation with the shape estimation from convolution followed by thresholding. So the left figure shows the STL file. The middle figure shows output of surrogate model, and the right figure shows the convolution shape estimated by convolution followed by thresholding, and the error between the convolution surrogate model is around 4%. So there is a lot of challenges in calculating convolution for a big part, because if your part, let's say a few thousand cube voxels, it gets computationally heavy. Although it's a few orders of magnitude faster than a multi-physics and a surrogate even model. But still, the amount of memory required is large and computationally large. And we represent a part with a 16 macron resolution. So if it has a few centimeters apart, it's computationally heavy. So we use GPU accelerated computing to speed up the convolution and visualization as well. And we use hierarchical data formatters OpenVDB to help optimize and store and for the computation. So it's a very challenging computational visualization problem. And summary, so we propose a novel approach to efficiently estimate a sprinted shape, accounting uncertainty, and we account it across different scale. We have a model at a different scale. We demonstrate that using simulated data that how it works, but it can be applied to any AM process and to experimentally collected data. I'm talking about convolution. And you can convolution you can implement it on GPU, because convolution is basically it's a multiplication on Fourier space. So it's a very efficient algorithm, and we use you can use this approach to, now you have a kernel, you can compare uncertainty and a different AM process of a different process parameter of the same AM setup. And you can, understanding a forward problem, having very fast forward problem with convolution, you can solve inverse problem. You can optimize shape for given toolpath. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Slava. That was a very impressive in-time presentation. We have one question asked here in the chat. The question is by Tim. You can just unmute yourself and ask the question once more. Tim, are you? I think Tim, it says here. The question was,
yeah.
Is there, or you want to ask the question, okay?
Yeah, so my question is whether the convolutional neural network is like used as a black box learning algorithm, or you use the convolutional network because it gives you an exact solution to the problem you are looking at.
Oh, CNN, it's so we have several reasons to use. First of all, it's already have regularization, because to solve the convolution equation you have to regularize it. So second, it's a convenient optimizer. Basically, they have an optimizer with respect to many variables. So it's already implemented in on GPU, etc. So it's it's not like a black box. It's basically it just use gradient descent to find the weights of the kernel, and the solution is not exact. It's you can never be sure that you converge to global minima. So it's a usually local minimum, but it converges pretty well. So you usually wait until it reaches convergence. Yeah, it's a convenient, but you can use different probably optimizer to find the convolution. You can write your own, but using CNN, training CNN was the most efficient one. So hopefully I answer your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? If so, you can order this by just putting something in the chat, or if there are there's so few takers, then we can also directly unmute yourself and ask the question. But if everyone unmutes, it's going to be tricky. So if you go via the chat, it's a little more organized.
So yeah, so then yeah, I see.
Is there a question? Then okay, unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, let me ask a question then here. So you use terms that were as manufactured in the paper, at least now in the presentation, it didn't come out so much. Is as manufactured in the paper the same thing as simulated? And then I was also a bit confused between simulation and experiment. And
yeah,
to top it off, there's a fifth item called surrogate. So I think you have a slide, and you could still share if you wanted to. You have a slide where you actually put them into relation. There was one slide that said validation, and
yeah. So let me open it. Yes.
so I'm just you seem to have different levels of experiments, some of which are computed, some of which are actually done in metal.
Yeah, so as manufactured, you can basically a simulation. It's not a different from experiment here. What is important point that in simulation you can control amount of uncertainty you introduce. Let's say when we simulate this cube, we know how much we introduce uncertainty only in the position of a droplet, like a location of a droplet. In the experiment, you cannot control because you have a mixture of all uncertainties from a droplet, let's say, if you consider this process. So it's hard to separate them. So yeah, so as manufactured, it's as printed, it's either from experiment, either from simulation. So it's not here just a convenient way to estimate this manufacturing shape. And validation, because the physics model is it takes a long time to simulate it. So we reduce the model to make it faster. So then, as soon as you have reduced the model, you can study uncertainty by Monte Carlo. So you can generate many parts with uncertainty in let's say in various parameters, and see how it translates to the part scale and analyze it at the part scale. Yeah, so and then convolution comes to play. Yes, so in principle you can skip a simulation part. Let's say if you have very control experiment, or you don't need to separate uncertainties, you can collect data from experiment for the convolution and estimate the part scale directly. So let's say you calculate a kernel, then you can study property of this kernel. What is the, let's say, standard deviation? What is the, and etc. other parameters. Yeah. So it's yes.
Yeah. Let me just make sure that no one else from the audience wants to ask a question. Is anyone just at this point? You just unmute yourself. I see Sai has himself unmuted.
Well, I was just going to add a comment to what Slava said. If no one else has a question,
Please do.
Okay, thanks. So I was just going to say that in part, the goal of this paper is also to qualify the process. So while you can get the experimental data, if it is clean and good data, to characterize a kernel for the part scale uncertainty, to be able to explain the evolution of the droplets via the physics model is also useful, because it gives us a way of understanding how the process actually works and how you can control it at that scale, the scale of the deposition. So this paper is about managing how to connect the uncertainty at the deposition scale to the uncertainty that gets accumulated at the part scale.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there a, so I guess there's still the question about, here we deal with droplets, and of course droplets are deposited along a path.
Mm-hmm.
And there's interaction between some of these droplets because of heat. Is that actually already included, that as they cool down? I guess in some of your piecewise experiments, you actually took the overall temperature into account, right? Of all the pieces.
Yes, we have a heat transfer equation, yes, solved.
Okay. All right. I have to cut myself short, and thank you very much, Slava and Sai.
Thank you.
The next speaker is, you could pull up, yeah, you have to free up the space. And if Prashant, there he is, would please pull up his slides. And Prashant's presentation is also about toolpaths, continuous toolpath planning in a graphical framework for sparse infill. And it's right on the same topic, additive manufacturing. And this is joint work by Prashant Gupta, who's going to present, Bala Krishnamurthy, and Gregory Dreyfus. Dreyfus?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay. All right, please take over the screen.
Okay, so I think we should start then. Okay, my name is Prashant Gupta and I'm a math PhD student at Washington State University. I'll be presenting this work on continuous toolpath planning in a graphical framework for sparse infill additive manufacturing. This is a joint work with my advisor, Bala Krishnamurthy, and our collaborator, Gregory Dreyfus. I would also like to thank NSF, DOE, and Oak Ridge National Lab for partially supporting our project. So I would like to start with explaining what is the setting of our problem. So setting of our problem is sparse infill. So let the region in blue what we are trying to fill. Then sparse infill, as opposed to dense infill, is when we are printing material only along the edges, which implies basically we can call it as a graph or a mesh. So we are calling it as a graphical model. We can also observe here, if we need to fill this infill, we need to make jumps at the boundaries. And if the boundary is really long and even long, then the number of jumps increases, scaling with the boundary. So longer boundary, then more jumps or discontinuities. So discontinuities can also create poor print quality, as observed by Kuipers and co-authors in 2019 SPM. As you can see in the figure, leakage and bulging. Even if you have a continuous path, the toolpath crossover can create poor print quality. Author of this paper gave a solution which built a pattern based on space filling curve, generate a geometric pattern. But their framework is not suitable to optimize the toolpath based on various mechanical properties like stress, temperature, or the turn cost for a geometric case. Well, now the question is, can you create a general mesh? I mean, for general mesh, can we have a thing where we can move and without jumping? Can we create a framework to print it continuously without crossover? Well, we also want the tool a way so that we can optimize the toolpath. We can use an Euler mesh where each vertex is connected to even number of vertices or edges, which guaranteed existence of an Euler tool. That means we can start at a vertex and end at the same vertex, covering each and every edge exactly once without jumping. As you can see in this figure, this is an Euler mesh. Each vertex is connected to 4 vertices. But there is one more thing to observe, that this Euler mesh has triangles and some pentagons. Well, now the question is, can we create an Euler mesh such that we only have triangles or pentagons, basically saying identical type of cells? That could be a challenging problem. For instance, triangulation where each vertex has even degree is an NP complete problem. Even having a tool with without crossover over a mesh is still an open problem. So we came up with this idea of how we can transform any general mesh into an Euler mesh. So if we are given an input mesh for any polygonal region, we can apply Euler transformation to generate Euler meshes. And we extended it for combinatorial and topological changes that can happen during Euler transformation. And we also presented a complete framework for continuous path planning, 3D printing applications for any kind of a region, a hole and without hole polygons in any layer. And then we gave finally a toolpath algorithm with no crossover. So now I'm going to give you an overview about Euler transformation. This is the previous work we did for both 2D and 3D cases. We call this paper is called Euler transformation of polyhedral complexes. And here I'm going to give you an overview about 2D case. So like as the figure A, as you can see on the left, is an input mesh. As you can see, some of the vertices had odd degree, which I mean is that each vertex is connected to odd number of vertices, and that will cause discontinuities. So what we did is that, so for this transformation, what we do is that for each cell or element in the input mesh, we create a metered offset. The metered offset is basically parallel offsetting of the edges of the cell. You can do it uniformly and you can do it non-uniformly, basically saying different amount of parallel offset. But for the case, for the simplicity right now, we are assuming it's a equal amount of offset for all the edges of the cell. So we apply this metered offset and we get these new cells, which shown in green and red. And then for each corresponding edge and vertex in the input mesh, we create new cells as shown in blue and orange in the figure on the right by joining these vertices. So as you can see, I joined these vertices and I got these new cells. Once we are done, we got an Euler mesh. As you can observe, each vertex is connected to 4 vertices. And we can also see that I can solve this problem in polynomial time. And also, you can see for each corresponding face in the input mesh, I will get a cell which is unique in the output mesh. And similarly, for each corresponding edge in blue in the input mesh, I will get a cell in output mesh which is unique. And similarly for the vertex which is shown in orange. So now I'm going to talk about some properties of Euler transformation. Let K is an input mesh and K hat is an output mesh. Then as we observe, each vertex is connected to 4 other vertices. And total number of vertices is 2 times the total number of edges in the input mesh. Total number of edges in the output mesh is total of 4 times the total number of edges in the input mesh. But although the total Euclidean length of edges in the output mesh is roughly double the total length in the input mesh of edges. And as we observe that the total number of faces in the output mesh is going to be sum of the vertices and edges and plus faces, as we discussed about it in the last slide. Okay, so now the question is, can we always do Euler transformation? So the answer for that is not always. There are certain conditions that need to be satisfied. So one of the main condition is that, so the adjacent edges of a cell, if shared by the same boundary, then you can have odd degree vertices. So in this case, think of it, this cell is the only mesh for the corresponding polygon, then the adjacent edges are shared with the boundary, so you can get odd degree vertices. But the thing we can do is that if we can apply the Euler transformation again, then we can get even degree vertices. So in any Euler, input mesh, after 2 iterations of Euler transformation, we will get even degree vertices where each vertex is connected to 4 vertices. Our transformation can also handle combinatorial topological changes. So the combinatorial changes is what happens is that, so when you apply meter offset, some of the edges in the input mesh can be small. So what happens is, and these edges shrunk when we increase the meter offset. So, so in this case, you can see figure on the left has a red cell, which is small. And as we increase the metered offset on the cell, as shown as F hat, the edge will shrink to a point and it will have odd degree vertices. But we can handle this by applying Euler transformation again for the local mesh. But some of the vertices now is not going to have degree 4, it can have degree 6. So yeah, that has to be kept in mind, although the mesh is going to be still Euler. So the detail of that we have presented in our paper. So the topological changes. Topological changes basically when you have a cell, as you can see something like that in the blue, it will split into 2 cells. And each vertex is still going to have a degree 4. So so topological changes doesn't affect the degree of the mesh. So I'm going to give you now an outline of our framework, how we implemented various things and how they connect with our work. So the input, let the parameter is the input STL file. Then we find the polygon for each and every layer. And once we have these polygons, what we do is that we project it to the base and take the union of it. So in the case of pyramid, you can see you can get a rectangle or a square, for instance. Then we can apply any input, any meshing tool which exists and mesh it using that. In our case, we are using hexagons. Once we do that, we apply Euler transformation and we get this transform mesh where each vertex is connected to 4 other vertices. And then for each and every polygon, we are going to clip in a layer. So we clip it, but the thing is, once we clip it, you can see that we again get odd degree vertices at the boundary. Well, for that, what we're going to do is that we are going to patch it. So once we patch it at the boundary, we have an Euler mesh. But as you can observe that the boundary vertices are at degree 2 now. And we can repeat this process for each and every layer and we get a pre-print parameter. We had also printed a couple of layers for this. So the pyramid was a simple shape. So the shapes can be complex. So for that, we are assuming epsilon continuity between the layers. So what does it mean is that, so given a point X in a layer, there exists a point Y in a layer below it, which is at most epsilon distance away from it. Intuitively speaking, it means basically how much overhanging we are allowing. So for that instance, that's why we assume that just to formalize mathematically the overhanging idea. So now the question is, once we patch this mesh, suppose for this example, we are going to add these red edges at the boundary. And now the question is, if you have a point on these red edges, will there always be material below it? By looking at, even if you have epsilon continuity, so intuitively speaking, if we think about it, it might look like, yeah, you should have a material if you satisfy epsilon continuity, right? But that's not true. We have a counterexample where even for the simpler cases, you can have a situation where the material will fall. So any point on these red edges might not be covered. For that reason, we decided maybe we need to print these boundary edges. So to do that, we added the zigzag parameter around it. But zigzag parameter can create poor print quality at the surface. So we can add a regular parameter around it for the quality. So now I'm going to show you Stanford Bunny where we completely implemented our framework. So we started with this first layer, which has a hole in it, and you can see regular and a zigzag parameter for the outer boundary and the hole, and some layers. We can also have multiple polygons in a layer, so we can handle that too. So now I'm going to talk about Toolpath algorithm for with no crossover on this Euler mesh. So let's say we have this Euler mesh as shown in the figure on the left. Then the goal is to find first Euler circuits. So the thing is, Euler circuits which are disjoint from each other, edge disjoint from each other, to be more clear. So you can intuitively think of it like peeling an onion. So the outermost layer is a circuit, then we peel that layer, and then again is another layer, which is again a circuit. So you can see all these circuits are shown in different color in the figure, blue, red, green, and yellow. Once we have these circuits, what we do is that based on their connectivity, build a circuit tree. So which basically means each node is a circuit and they are connected by an edge, and it doesn't have any cycle. Once we have a circuit tree, what we do is that based on their edges in the circuit tree, we add these restrictions into our Euler mesh. So basically saying, so when we start traversing this Euler mesh, let's say from the outside, then as we hit the first restriction, we switch the circuit. So suppose we start from the blue, which is the outer one, and then we hit the restriction, then we switch the circuit to the red. And then again, we hit the restriction, then we switch the circuit to the yellow. And then we keep on traversing like that until the whole Euler mesh is finished. In this way, as you can see, there is no crossover, and we can and we are able to traverse the whole Euler mesh. So now I'm going to show you a toolpath for one of the layers in the Stanford Bunny, which is basically actually the layer 1. So we start with traversing the outermost boundary, then we add the zigzag parameter around the boundary, and then we start with innermost vertex in the Euler mesh, and based on the restriction, we start traversing this mesh. Although I could have done better, instead of starting from the innermost, I can pick the vertex at the boundary of the Euler mesh. That should not be a problem because this is just a sequence of vertices. Then we add the inner zigzag parameter and the regular parameter for the whole, just to keep the good quality finish. So that's what we have about the problem. Now I'm going to talk about some of the open problems that comes out from our work. So the toolpath algorithm that I showed shows an existence of a toolpath with no crossover, but it is not optimized from perspective of the mechanical properties or the geometric terms. So we need to look also into how we can optimize the properties of our print based on various mechanical parameters and also the turn cost. So the infill lattice, so the input mesh where we applied this transformation, how the properties of it are affected by the transformation. So how much stress, strain, and how much elasticity and all those things are affected once we apply this transformation need to be studied. Can we implement this framework for surface meshes where Yep. So so how we can apply these offsets such that we can able to do that also in, on the surface meshes. And can we extend it for non-planar 3D printing applications? That's it from my side. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prashant.
Thank you.
I didn't see any questions in the chat. Does anyone of the audience want to simply unmute themselves and ask a question? While you think about that, I'm going to preempt Ergun, who probably wants to observe that the paths that you're generating actually look very nice to someone who creates surfaces. So we have something in the subdivision literature that is a dual subdivision.
Yep.
And those kind of paths actually look very similar to what you're generating as your, and they're known for keeping the valence of the facets and for changing the valence of the vertices to exactly 4.
Yep.
But then, of course, you have the additional challenge. It's clear to get an Euler path that actually connects everything. That's.
Yep. So yeah. So I think those subdivisions, yeah, pretty nice. And I think the most the thing which is very similar to us is called Dou-7 subdivision. And the thing is, so you get 4 valence, but the thing is, if you have complex geometry, you can have a complex, really complex meshes. It's in general application. I'm not saying that people use this all the time. But if you apply the metered offset thing, it's very dynamic. So you can, your mesh can change based on those combinatorial and topological changes. But those things are actually are not handled by Dou-7. Exactly pick a point where it needs to fit, apply these offsets, kind of a thing. And in that way, our work is a little different from what they are doing. But being said, you not always have to use Euler transformation, but still these things of like what should say. And again, still, if you have a graph which is like a quadrilateral one, where each vertex is connected to 4 the vertices, you might want to clip it, actually. So it actually helps us to also extend, let us use those meshes and still use our framework to print continuously.
I see that Ergun is unmuted. Maybe that's a good way of doing it. If you simply unmute yourself, I will then call you out for asking questions. Ergun?
Yeah, actually, I agree with you. Like in addition to Dou-7, there is also the dual of the simplest, and then it can give a even simpler structure. And then actually, I tried with it. It's not for the 3D printing, but it's useful also to create the fabric structures, because they come from the same idea. Because you can just go like create the Euler path directly, and then it's much simpler mesh than Dou-7. Therefore, it can be. Actually, I was thinking about it, and then Jorg asked questions like that.
Yeah, yeah, it is actually, it is actually been asked enough. So, but I think this is the creating dual actually really helps in general, because even like in the future, is somebody doing some sort of even just on the table, like any sort of machine learning kind of approaches, you want something regularity in your graph and any sort of optimization. So having a dual actually make the problem easier in terms of toolpath actually also.
Actually, if you download the top mod, I have all the subdivision existed. You can try that. Like and then I organize them in terms of 4 valence preserving, 4 valence creating, 3 valence, something like that. You can download it from my website.
Oh, thank you very much.
That
Yeah,
way we can write each other. Yeah.
yeah, sure.
Okay. I have to cut in for a moment, and
Yeah, sorry.
Prashant, don't forget to unshare your screen
Okay.
so that we give time for Yuna to set up.
Okay.
Thank you. Yuna, okay, very good. So the last presentation is by, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Yuna Levayu.
Yes.
Okay, okay. And Jean-Claude Léon, Stephanie Hamann, Stéphane Masser, and Mathieu Mika. And it is as stiff as needed. Well, I'm reading out what everyone can see in front of them. About surface deformation, but doing the surface deformation in a very organized fashion for difficult models. Okay, you are on. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So I'm a PhD student at the Laboratoire Jean Kunzmann and the Imagine team at INRIA. And this work was done in collaboration with the Groupe PSA automotive manufacturer. So first, I'll quickly give the motivation of our work in the context of automotive design, and then I will focus on our as-on surface deformation method. So the design process is led by design review, nowadays often done in virtual reality. However, in the current system, we cannot modify the shape. So based on interviews with several professional designers, we decided to focus first on modifying the proportions, for example, to shorten or elongate some parts. And given the design review's constraints, we wanted to offer a tool that was intuitive, offering a shape-preserving deformation in interactive time. So after analyzing existing contributions, we would say that studying things from a mechanical point of view helped us improve the state-of-the-art method to propose our as stiff as needed surface deformation. So mesh deformation is a wide field of research, and I will not make here an exhaustive review, but we divided the relevant method for our context into two families. On the one side, a method based on auxiliary structure, such as skeleton or cage-based methods. But while being useful for character animation, it needs a proper structures that often leads to too many degrees of freedom, which makes it hard to manipulate. So on the other side, a method using
Yuna, for a second.
Yes.
I might have hit a wrong key someplace, but I'm seeing my own face. Do you all, do the viewers all see your slides?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Then it's just my screen that is messed up. Sorry, please.
Okay.
Sorry for the interrupt, Yuna.
It's okay. So I was saying that we looked at method based on physically based energy, and that offer fewer degrees of freedom and an intuitive interaction through a handle metaphor. So we found this category of method more suitable for design reviews, and more particularly, the Arab method by Sorkin and Alexa caught our attention. But while Arab gives a good result for characters and can handle large displacement, it is, however, too organic for man-made shapes. And in order to improve this behavior, one seek a way to get a stiffer deformation. So many Arab variants offer to do so, and to explain these, we first need to describe the initial Arab method. So Sorkin and Alexa's idea is to consider the mesh as a set of overlapping cells, and then to express the deformation as an energy minimization problem. So this minimization is iterative, and each iteration has two steps. So first they optimize the rotations while fixing the position, and then they optimize the positions while fixing the rotations. And this energy also involves cotangent weights computed for each edge. So in the initial method of Sorkin and Alexa, only the spoke edges were taken into account, but this could cause robustness issue that were solved by Cao and colleagues, who added the rim edges as well. And they also got this way a better equivalence with a continuous strain energy. Then several strategies were developed to get some stiffening effect. So Chen and colleagues proposed to increase the cell size. Levy and colleagues added a bending stiffness term weighted by a global parameter. And Zhao and colleagues also weighed stretching and a bending energy, again by a global parameter. So we compared these methods through a simple test. So we took this shape with positive curvature everywhere and pulled it stop. So the goal was to preserve the initial curvature distribution. But we can see that even if we chose the parameters that reached the maximum stiffness for each method, they couldn't preserve the initial curvature distribution, and curvature sign changes appear here in blue. So we will explain this behavior through our mechanical analysis in the next part, but we can already consider another way to control the deformation process, which is by changing the deformation amplitudes along the direction. So in other words, to introduce an isotropy. So this idea is not new, but the behavior obtained with the state-of-the-art method is not related to a mechanical anisotropic material, thus not predictable enough. Our insight was indeed that to get an intuitive deformation, it had to be predictable, and to be predictable, it had to be as close as possible to a mechanical behavior. So I will now take a few slides to present things from a mechanical point of view, and for that, let's consider a domain omega. So omega is subjected to boundary constraints that can be forces or displacements. And since omega is a deformable body, the constraints will create internal resultants known as stresses, displacements, and strains. So in order to find the solution fields, continuum mechanics give us a set of equations from which we derive partial differential equations. And more particularly, we get a continuous strain energy that we want to minimize. So this strain energy is related, involves the tensor D, and this tensor D is related to stresses and strains in the material constitutive law. So now if we take a look back at our surface deformation methods, the questions are, what simplifying hypotheses are usually set in link with the continuum mechanics, and how can we express D with this hypothesis? So a first hypothesis is set on the material, which is usually considered as elastic, linear, and isotropic. And thus, in this case, the behavior can be described with the Young modulus E, characterizing the stiffness, and the Poisson's ratio that characterize the lateral contraction. And for this linear, elastic, isotropic material, the Hooke's law gives us the constitutive law that can be written as such for a general 3D elementary domain. So this expression can be simplified depending on the medium structure. And since we are considering car body surfaces, we can set a second simplifying hypothesis on the medium, that is that one dimension, so here the thickness, is smaller than the other. So this corresponds to membranes or shells. And in this plane stress state, where only in-plane forces are considered, we can ignore some stresses components and get an expression of D that is simplified. So we get a simplified version of D, but the geometry of the mesh is still complex, so we cannot go further to solve the energy minimization analytically. And for this kind of complex domains, numerical methods such as finite element methods are usually used. So the idea is to discretize the domain into elements. On each, we will define an elementary strain energy, and then the resolution is done on each minimum, and an interpolation gives the global solution. So at first sight, one could think that R-based methods are similar to mechanical FEM computation with triangle elements. But one major difference is that instead of defining shape function on each element, like it is the case for mechanical approaches, in R-based method, linear hat shape functions are defined on a whole cell. And besides, even in each approach, we can get what is called a stiffness matrix. In mechanical approaches, to handle large displacement, this matrix has to be updated at each iteration, whereas for R-based method, the stiffness matrix is computed only once, that allows for faster computation. So the downside is that we cannot say precisely what mechanical elements would match this formulation. However, what we can say is that Arab-based methods have no local thickness parameter. And since bending deformation depends on the thickness, the behavior of Arab-based methods are closer to a membrane element where stresses are considered constant through the thickness. So if we look back at our method, because they use triangular elements with linear H-shape functions, these Arab-based methods are restricted to a membrane behavior. And the bending stiffness that has been inserted through global parameters in the other method does not enable a local control of the stiffness distribution. And this explains why the Arab-based method could not give an appropriate stiffness to preserve the initial shape in our test. However, these methods still have the advantages of handling large displacement and offering quick computations. So that is why we decided to stick with this approach, but we will use another way, mechanically coherent, to increase the stiffness and control it locally, which is by using an anisotropic material. So since Arab deformation energy is weighted, we follow Boch and Cobel's idea to change the weights, and we compute these new weights directly on the 3D mesh. So we transform the 3D mesh by stretching the model and compute the anisotropic weights on this stretch mesh. And then the combination of these anisotropic weights with the initial 3D position give us our anisotropic material. So this way we obtain our mechanical behavior from a geometric transformation without having the user to deal with the mechanical parameters. So in order to validate our mechanical behavior, we realized attraction tests similar to real-life mechanical tests. So we fixed the base of the shape and pulled it up, imposing a displacement d that can be seen as the load. And our results show that the anisotropic weights that we define coherent fiber directions where the deformation gets stiffer, and even on an irregular mesh like this one. So from a more theoretical point of view, we have shown that these new weights can be interpreted as a change of the material behavior law, and that different Young moduli are defined according to the anisotropy directions. So in other words, the transformation tau introduces a fiber direction on each triangle independent of the tessellation. So still, the transformation tau has two parameters that we want to set to reduce the user's degrees of freedom. So we set the direction of orthotropy to be equal to the direction of displacement. And this way, the sections perpendicular to the displacement get stiffer, which is easy to control. And for the parameter mu, according to our test, a value of 100 was in general stiff enough. So thus, we completely defined our new material, but recall that we also need to take the medium structure into account. And for that, we considered the two Arab methods that were the closest to a mechanical membrane medium to choose with which one use our anisotropic weights. And while Arab M gives artifact near the handle, Arab spokes and rims behaves better. And we thus chose this method as the functional defining our structural medium. So to summarize, our Hasan deformation method let us increase the stiffness by changing the material into a virtual anisotropic material through a simple transformation whose parameter can be set for intuitive use. And this orthotropic material is then inserted into a membrane behavior to set a local structural stiffness. So let me now present quickly some results. So taking again our initial test, our Hasan method is able to preserve the initial curvature. And this is still valid for a more complex shape where artifacts seen near the handle with state-of-the-art method disappear with our Hasan method. Our Hasan deformation also gives good results for man-made shapes, and it indeed preserves here sharp edges. And on this example, planar areas as well, without specifying any additional constraints. So finally, on this example, on a real industrial model, we can see that when we elongate the hood, the initial shape is preserved. And to quantify this preservation, we computed the map of discrete Gaussian curvature sign. And we see that the initial sign is well preserved with our Azan method. So to conclude, our Azan deformation method gives appropriate mechanical stiffness obtained by computing anisotropic weights in a surprisingly simple yet quite effective manner. And the user can then deform man-made shapes in an intuitive way and in interactive time. So an important topic would be also to extend the method to rotation deformations. And one idea for that would be to decompose the rotation and change the anisotropic direction during the deformation. Moreover, since our deformation has mechanical behavior, it would be good to warn the user in case of mechanical incompatibilities between the displacement and the constraints. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Yuna. And yes, I will look again at the participants. Once you unmute yourself, you can ask a question. I'm just searching through the list. So if you're unmuting yourself, I think I will see you and call you by name.
I have the video also if we have time and there is no questions.
We do have time. That is very good. Maybe you should first show the video, then everyone can still think whether and what question they want to ask. Thank you.
So just before launching the video, so this video is about the displacements of a wheel arch, and this is a deformation. This is a deformation that we saw on real like design review example, and I wanted to give some precision about the deformation amplitudes because it's usually quite like usually it's below 100 millimeter, because in design reviews the goal is to improve the current design and not to change drastically the models. So the deformation that we were requested to do by our designer was a displacement of a wheel arch of 55 millimeters. So you'll have to pay attention in the video. And this can look simple, but in state-of-the-art method, it led to unexpected results. So we were happy to achieve this. So on the left side, you can see the view inside the cave, and on the right side, a computer view. So we use a selection sphere for the user to paint the constraints on the model. So the handle region in green, and then the fixed region in red. And the region of interest will then be computed from these two constraints. So it will quickly appear in blue here. And then the user can control the displacement by only his gesture. So the direction and the amplitude is given by the user. And to better see the impact of the deformation, he can then compare between here initial and then deformed. No, so I hope that with the internet stream, you were able to see the deformation well, but that is how it takes place in the cave.
Thank you very much. And we can ask anyone who wants to ask a question. Otherwise, I'll jump in. Let me just make sure that I'm not overlooking anyone. Nope, they're all muted at this point. I'm curious about the representation, Yuna, that you're choosing during the time of this deformation.
Oh yes, so it's we consider several. So the meshes that we were given were CAD surfaces, so NURBS patches, but what the designer usually do is that they use computer-aided styling software to modify the model, and it's quite complicated for a user that is not familiar with this representation to modify the model. So what we did is that we used, so from these parametric models, we used a software that is called Pixies to obtain a connected triangular mesh that then we can deform using the Arab deformation method. So I hope it answers your question.
Excellent answer. That really was exactly what I was looking for. And
Okay.
I'm both pleased and somewhat surprised that these reviewers actually use caves, the CAVE.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to be an easy environment. I mean, yes, you have a lot of motion and freedom of placement.
Mm-hmm.
But is this really the state of the art, that people kneel down or stand up in CAVE's caves?
Caves. So it depends on the. I don't have. I'm not sure I have here a picture. Wait, let me see quickly. Actually, at least at PSA, they have both systems. And they use, no, I don't have any representation. They also have head-mounted displays, so maybe that's what you were thinking about more. The good thing with the cave is that the resolution that you get, the definition that you get of the image is really higher than what is done with HMDs. And so that's why for detailed model, they people still go into the cave. But yeah, you're right. The use of head-mounted displays has increased a lot since it's easier to, like, it's more, it's a lighter system,
Mm-hmm.
so that user can have it in their studios. In the design studio, they have virtual headsets and they use it as well. It's the state of the art, at least at PSA. It's a combination of both, depending on the needs of the users. If that answers your question.
Thank you very much. I don't see.
Sorry, I just found the image, but here you can see. So you, for example, for interiors, they have a replica of a seat, and you can and they can use this system to have a look at what they are designing. But yeah, so they use both to answer your question.
Thank you for a very nice presentation. This is also my opportunity to thank all three speakers, Slava, Prashant, and Una just now, for staying on time and giving excellent presentations. If Frédéric is there, one of the pieces of information that he might be sending out still is where we can leave our slides. I know we had an invitation to place our slides, but that was, what, 4 or 5 days before the conference, and no slides are done. They're done 5 minutes before the presentation for some people.
Okay, so
if Frédéric, if you at some point want to send us all a note as to where we can upload.
Yeah. So I'm just doing this right now, just looking for the link. This will come very soon.
And now I think everyone here, it's difficult to applaud. I guess we can all put a thumbs up or something like that, but even that is a little silly. Thank you all for attending these sessions. There is a way to ask questions via the system discourse, which I haven't personally really gotten to work for myself, but it is possible. And of course, there's always email. And there will be the final session of SPM in just a moment. So many of you probably want to switch off here. Frederic, we switch out of this particular room and go into another room, right?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, so, okay, so we all have to probably leave this room now. Thank you all for attending, and thank you all for presenting. And we close this session, and if you can switch over to the meeting room for the final closeout of this conference.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
George.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorg.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.